Kristen was 5 years old when she was living with her parents in Trafford, Pennsylvania. At the time, she recalls, her grandmother was in the hospital recovering from a stroke. She and I were very close, Kristen says. I never got to visit her in the hospital. My mom and dad thought it would be too much for me to handle at such a young age. Early Sunday morning around 5 a.m., Kristen was suddenly awakened and sat straight up in her bed. I saw a woman's figure standing at the end of my bed, she says. Thinking the figure was her mother, Kristen had no reason to be frightened. She called out to the woman, but there was no answer. Again she called, "Mommy," but there was only silence. The woman just stood there staring at me and extended her arm, Kristen recalls. I began to panic because I didn't know why my mom wasn't responding to me. I began to scream, "Mom!" Kristen's mother came running into her room to see what was wrong. She asked me if I was okay and asked her why she wasn't answering me and why she was standing there just staring at me, she says. She came and sat on my bed, felt my head to make sure I wasn't spiking a fever, and told me I must have been dreaming. She told me she was in bed sleeping the whole time. Kristen reluctantly accepted her mother's answer and went back to sleep. Later that morning, Kristen's parents received a phone call from her uncle. It was news about Kristen's grandmother. She had passed in her sleep during the early morning hours. My mom began to cry, but composed herself to continue the conversation, says Kristen. Her brother informed her the time of death was about 5 a.m. that morning. She explained to me that Grandma had passed away, and now she would not be in pain, and she was an angel in heaven. It wasn't until a few days later that Kristen's mother connected the time of her mother's passing and Kristen's waking vision of the shadowy woman in her room. She didn't tell me this story until I was about 10 years old, Kristen says. I remember it so clearly as she told it to me, and I realized it was my grandmother coming to see me and say goodbye. It was the spring of 1990, when Josh, his brother Aaron, and his mother were living in a mobile home on a farm outside of Laurelville, Ohio. On this night, Josh awoke from a disturbing nightmare. Today he cannot recall the details of the bad dream, but he does remember that it scared him enough that he had to get out of bed to seek his mother's comfort. I walked up the short hallway to my mother's room to try and crawl in bed with her, Josh says. She told me to go back to my bed, so I walked back toward my room, which I shared with my brother Aaron. Josh was not prepared for what he encountered as he began to enter his room. I will never forget what I saw. There on my brother's bedpost was a dark figure that looked like a gargoyle or gremlin. I really couldn't make out anything like its feet or legs. It just had a really square, rigid head like a gargoyle. It was about 2 feet tall and was hunched over a bit and was looking at Aaron. I stopped dead in my tracks and gasped when I saw it. It turned its head as if it heard me. I couldn't see any eyes, just the outline of its face. Terrified, Josh turned and ran back into his mother's room. Figuring Josh was just in need of a little assurance, she walked him back to his bedroom to show that there was no monster there. And indeed, there wasn't. Whatever Josh saw was now gone. She didn't believe me, so I just tried to forget it, Josh says. I didn't mention it to anyone after that night. So it must have been Josh's imagination, influenced by his nightmare, right? A few years later, when Josh was in 10th grade, he was sitting with a classmate named Ryan. Josh noticed a few large scars on his neck and asked Ryan how he got them. Ryan said that when he was about 8 years old, he accidentally ran through a sliding glass door. He claimed the cuts almost killed him due to blood loss. But then he confessed to Josh a strange element to the story. The strange thing was, Ryan told him, the night before the accident, My brother saw a little dark figure sitting on my bed watching me sleep. As Ryan described it, what his brother had seen sounded exactly like the gargoyle-like creature Josh had encountered. Sandy wanted to call her grandmother to ask her about the new Chatty Cathy doll and the other presents she received for Christmas. The house phone was hung up high on the wall, however, too high for her to reach without help. Unfortunately, her dad and her brother had gone out to shovel snow, and her mother was in the shower. Sandy couldn't wait. She thought she would burst if she couldn't tell her grandmother right away about her new treasures. I was becoming increasingly impatient, she remembers. I decided to pretend to call my grandmother on the toy telephone I got for Christmas. Back then, where I lived, there were no dial phones. All calls were operator-assisted, and when I picked up the receiver on my toy telephone, I distinctively heard an operator say, "What number, please?" I was shocked, but I told her my grandmother's number, which I still remember to this day. I heard the phone begin to ring, and soon my grandmother, with her heavy Italian accent, was saying hello. I immediately began telling her all about my Chatty Cathy doll, but she wanted to know where my mother was. I explained that my mother was in the shower, and my dad and brother were outside. She knew that I could not use the telephone by myself, and asked me how I climbed up to use the telephone high up on the wall. I explained that I had called her on my toy telephone. She laughed heartily before telling me to have my mother call when she got out of the shower. When my mother got out of the shower, I tried to tell her that I had really talked to Grandma on my toy phone, and that she wanted my mother to call her. My mother laughed like my grandmother did, but since I kept insisting that she call Grandma, she finally did. When she discovered that I had really talked to my grandmother, I got in big trouble. My mother insisted I had somehow dangerously climbed the wall to use the phone. I insisted that I had called Grandmother on my toy phone and got in big trouble for lying. Sandy spent the rest of Christmas in her room, falsely accused of dangerous climbing and lying. I was frustrated about that, she says, but I couldn't help but smile over the fact that I had somehow called my grandmother on my toy telephone that Christmas morning. It had to be magic. In early summer of 1954, Douglas was 8 years old and living in an eastern suburb of London, England, close to Epping Forest. His neighborhood was a mixture of terraced 1930s houses interspersed with fields, empty lots where the houses had been destroyed by German bombing and nature had taken over, much to the pleasure of the kids. It was tough going for Douglas in those days. My dad had just left, he says. The stress of the war and the lure of a young woman. My mom and 2 sisters and I lived on, feeding on potatoes, cabbage, eggs, and bread. Mom got a job at the engineering factory just around the corner to pay the home loan. One particular day after lunch, Douglas walked his mother back to her job before he was heading off to school. He asked if he could have a few pennies to buy some candy. I can still see the open handbag and the big leather purse she opened, which was empty, Douglas recalls. I can still feel the immense mutual embracement that there was no pocket money to be had. I skipped away wishing I had never asked. Douglas ran across a field behind some shops, then on a mud path through the grass across another open space. Still craving sweets, he decided to employ a higher authority. In my grief and childish need, I just demanded of Jesus pocket money for sweets, he says. In reply, a deep male voice somewhere above and behind me said, "Kick the grass." I looked about. I was alone. I kicked the grass. "Kick the grass," said the voice, and I did again. This was a clump of solid wild grass, almost wild oats that seemed to take over bomb sites in those days. "Kick the grass again," said the voice, and I did. Out of the grass rolled a hexagonal coin worth 3 pence in those days. Elated with his astonishing luck, Douglas dashed off to the sweet shop with his coin and consumed the rest of his surreal experience. I've thought of this occurrence throughout my life, Douglas reflects, and have no conclusions except that it actually happened and I consumed the result. To my knowledge, the voice was coming from just behind and above me, although no one was there. The voice was deep, English and male, and I didn't recognize it. My further attempts at securing instant money by praying did not work. Alice was 8 years old and living in Glasgow, Scotland. In those years, Alice's parents would often visit an elderly woman they knew, just to look in on her from time to time. This kind lady would sometimes request that Alice and her younger sister to sleep over at her house. I have no idea why, Alice says, because she was really old and she didn't ever pay us any attention. But she was recently widowed, so maybe she was just lonely. One night, Alice and her sister slept over in the woman's guest room. It was a small room with very old furniture, a double bed with a mahogany headboard that had a pole cord light attached to it, a mahogany tallboy, and a matching mahogany dressing table and chair. The dressing table had 3 mirrors, a large one in the center, with 2 smaller ones on either side. Alice was having trouble sleeping that night. The heat made her feel very uncomfortable, and her sister's persistent and loud snoring seemed intent on keeping her awake. The bed had loads of blankets on it, and I reached out and pulled the cord on the light so that I could see to push some of the blankets off me, Alice says. As I sat up, I found myself looking straight into the dressing table mirror. Alice did not see her own reflection in the mirror, however. Instead, it was that of an old, slim lady with white curly hair. She was wrapped in a huge white bath towel, Alice remembers. Her head was bent down, as if she was looking at the ground. With her arms crossed in front of herself, she was rubbing her upper arms with the ends of the towel. The room she was in was different than the guest room. It had brown wood paneling on the wall that stopped about 3/4 of the way up. It was finished off with a picture rail around it. Then the lady stopped rubbing her arms. She lifted her head and she looked up at me and smiled. Terrified, Alice slid under the ton of blankets and stayed there with the light still on until the room filled with daylight. I know I was not dreaming, she insists. I've gone over that episode so many times in my mind. Although as an 8-year-old child I was petrified, as an adult, I also know that the spirit did not hurt me, nor did she do anything that makes me think she wanted to hurt me. Who she was or why she wanted me to see her is a mystery to me. There's one less intriguing piece to the story. When Alice went into the bedroom of her kind, elderly host, she noticed that she too had a dressing table with a mirror, but hers was covered completely with a pink shawl. I knew straight away that she too had seen something in her mirror, Alice says. I wish I could go back in time and ask her questions about it. Rachel's youngest baby was 6 months old, and Rachel was living with her parents in Bethany, Oklahoma. With the baby sound asleep, Rachel, her mother, and stepfather all stepped outside the house for a smoke, keeping tabs on the infant via a baby monitor. My daughter had been asleep for about 2 hours, Rachel says. All of a sudden, my mom and I heard talking from the monitor. We just looked at each other. Then I would hear my daughter laugh, like someone was playing with her. At first I thought that maybe we were hearing a signal from another monitor in someone else's apartment. Then the talking stopped, and the female that was talking began to sing. It was the same voice we heard talking. The woman was even saying my daughter's name in the song, Elena. Alarmed, Rachel rushed into the house to check on her daughter. Her mother was still listening on the monitor, and as soon as she heard Rachel open the door to the baby's room, the singing stopped. When I went into the room, says Rachel, there was no one there. So I went back outside, and the singing had started again. I asked my mom if she knew who the female was who was singing and talking to my daughter. She looked at me and smiled warmly. She said that she believed it was her great-great-grandmother. Kristen was suddenly awakened and sat straight up in her bed. I saw a woman's figure standing at the end of my bed, she says. Thinking the figure was her mother, Kristen had no reason to be frightened. She called out to the woman, but there was no answer. Again she called, "Mommy," but there was only silence. The woman just stood there staring at me and extended her arm, make sure I wasn't spiking a fever, and told me I must have been dreaming. She told me she was in bed sleeping the whole time. Kristen reluctantly accepted her mother's answer and went back to sleep. Later that morning, Kristen's parents received a phone call from her uncle. It was news about Kristen's grandmother. She had passed in her sleep during the early morning hours. Kristen recalls, I began to panic because I didn't know why my mom wasn't responding to me. I began to scream, "Mom!" Kristen's mother came running into her room to see what was wrong. She asked me if I was okay and asked her why she wasn't answering me and why she was standing there just staring at me, she says. She came and sat on my bed, felt my head to me. My mom began to cry, but composed herself to continue the conversation, says Kristen. Her brother informed her the time of death was about 5 a.m. that morning. She explained to me that Grandma had passed away, and now she would not be in pain, and she was an angel in heaven. It wasn't until a few days later that Kristen's mother connected the time of her mother's passing, and Kristen was 5 years old when she was living with her parents in Trafford, Pennsylvania. At the time, she recalls, her grandmother was in the hospital recovering from a stroke. She and I were very close, Kristen says. I never got to visit her in the hospital. My mom and dad thought it would be too much for me to handle at such a young age. Early Sunday morning around 5 a.m.,